What if one of the most important Soviet offensives of the entire war depended on a single bridgehead that refused to fall for half a year? And what if this forgotten patch of land on the Vistula quietly determined the fate of Poland, the collapse of Germany's eastern defenses, and the road to Berlin itself? The Baranów Bridgehead is not just a battlefield, it's the hidden hinge on which the end of the war turned. The formation of the Baranów Bridgehead in the summer of 1944 emerged from the rapid operational changes that followed the Soviet advance during Operation Bagration. As German Army Group North Ukraine withdrew across eastern Poland, retreating elements of the 4th Panzer Army and associated corps attempted to stabilize defensive lines along major natural barriers. The Vistula River, running north-south through the region, became the most significant geographic feature for anchoring new German defenses. Soviet forces, advancing with approximately 1 million personnel across multiple fronts, sought to prevent the Wehrmacht from consolidating along this river by establishing several bridgeheads on the western bank. The Baranów-Sandomiersky sector, positioned roughly between Sandomierz and Tarnobrzeg, emerged as one of the largest and most enduring of these crossings. The Soviet First Ukrainian Front, commanded by Marshal Ivan Konev, played the central role in establishing the bridgehead. Following breakthroughs near Lublin and the rapid exploitation of weakened German positions in July 1944, Konev redirected major elements, including the 5th Guards Army, the 13th Army, and armored spearheads from the 3rd Guards Tank Army toward the Vistula. Their objective was not only to force the river, but also to secure enough territory on the western bank to support future offensives into southern Poland and, eventually, toward Upper Silesia. Intelligence summaries from Soviet staff assessments indicated that German forces, though retreating, retained enough cohesion to potentially conduct a counterattack if the crossings remained shallow or fragmented. Consequently, Konev prioritized rapid expansion of bridgeheads to operational depth before German reserves could arrive. On the German side, the situation prior to the formation of the bridgehead reflected the deteriorating conditions caused by heavy losses during the summer fighting. Army Group North Ukraine, under Field Marshal Walter Model and later under General Joseph Harp, faced persistent shortages of armor, fuel, and transport. Of the approximately 450 tanks and assault guns available in mid-June, fewer than 200 remained operational by early August. Divisions across the front reported deficits of 40 to 60% in infantry strength. Intelligence estimates from German headquarters acknowledged a high probability of Soviet attempts to cross the Vistula at multiple points, but the speed of the Soviet advance complicated preparations for organized defensive positions. Civilian populations in the surrounding region experienced immediate disruption as the front approached. Villages near Baranów, Sandomiersky saw evacuations, requisitioning of horses and carts, destruction of bridges, and movement restrictions imposed by Soviet forces securing the riverbank. German military authorities in nearby towns ordered removals of remaining administrative staff, redistribution of local food stocks, and demolition of infrastructure deemed militarily valuable. Civilians fleeing both advancing and withdrawing forces contributed to significant traffic congestion, complicating military logistics for both sides. The geopolitical context framing these developments reflected the broader strategic realignment in Eastern Europe. With Romania on the verge of defection and German defensive lines collapsing in Belarus and Poland, the Vistula line became one of the last major natural barriers available to the Wehrmacht for delaying Soviet advances toward Germany's industrial heartland. The retention of territories in the Vistula region also held political significance, as German leadership sought to prevent Soviet occupation of territories historically disputed between Poland and Germany. For the Soviet Union, advancing toward the Vistula represented not only a military opportunity, but also a symbolic and political step toward liberating Polish territory and influencing post-war arrangements. The logistical situation for both armies shaped the early development of the Baranów Bridgehead. Soviet armored units exhausted significant quantities of fuel during the July pursuit operations, forcing temporary pauses before river crossing operations could proceed. Pontoon bridges, built by engineering battalions under combat conditions, required protection from German artillery and airstrikes. Meanwhile, German forces attempting to regroup along the Vistula faced shortages of ammunition, weak communication networks, and disruptions caused by the destruction of infrastructure. Reports from German quartermaster offices recorded fuel deliveries falling to as little as 30% of requested amounts in late July, contributing to delays in establishing defensive positions. Soviet intelligence assessments suggested that the German 4th Panzer Army would attempt to prevent a large-scale crossing at Baranov by concentrating remaining armor and artillery along the western bank. However, the speed and coordination of the Soviet advance prevented German forces from arriving in time to secure the area before Soviet lead elements crossed the river. By the first days of August 1944, the Soviets controlled a corridor several kilometers deep and began reinforcing it with infantry divisions supported by anti-tank artillery regiments. Public sentiment among German civilians and military circles reflected growing anxiety about the implications of the Soviet advance. Propaganda emphasized the necessity of holding the Vistula line to protect the Reich's eastern territories, while internal reports acknowledged widespread concern about the performance of retreating units. Conversely, Soviet morale remained high following major victories during Operation Bagration, though logistical delays and heavy casualties in earlier stages tempered immediate expectations of rapid exploitation beyond the river. Thus, the Baranów Bridgehead formed within a wider context defined by collapsing German defensive capacity, rapid Soviet offensives, and significant political stakes tied to the future of Eastern Europe. The conditions that produced the bridgehead shaped its eventual role as one of the most heavily contested and longest-held Soviet positions on the western bank of the Vistula. The establishment of the Baranów Bridgehead in early August 1944 marked the beginning of a series of rapid military actions as Soviet lead elements attempted to consolidate their foothold west of the Vistula before German countermeasures could take effect. The first major crossings were conducted by forward detachments of the 13th Army and the 5th Guards Army, which used improvised rafts, assault boats, and locally constructed pontoons to move infantry across the river under limited German fire. Initial resistance consisted primarily of rearguard elements from German infantry divisions, withdrawing from engagements east of the river. These units, depleted and lacking heavy equipment, were unable to mount organized defensive efforts. As a result, Soviet forces secured a shallow perimeter within hours, allowing engineering units to begin constructing the first temporary bridges. While the swift Soviet movement provided an early advantage, German commanders responded by attempting to form an improvised defensive line along the western bank. Field Marshal Walter Model, still overseeing Army Group North Ukraine during this phase, ordered available reserves from the 20th Panzer Division, the 68th Infantry Division, and the 17th Panzer Division to concentrate near Mielec and Tarnobrzeg. These formations, though under strength, retained enough armor and motorized elements to threaten the expanding Soviet bridgehead. German command staffs recognized that delaying a full Soviet consolidation was essential to restoring control of the Vistula line, and therefore prioritized rapid concentration of mobile units despite fuel shortages and disorganized communications. In the opening days, German artillery attempted to disrupt Soviet bridge building by targeting pontoon construction sites, assembly points, and riverbank positions. However, limited ammunition supplies and the lack of coordinated fire direction reduced the effectiveness of these attacks. Soviet counter-battery units responded quickly, suppressing several German gun positions. Air operations during this stage were relatively limited due to weather conditions and the depletion of Luftwaffe resources in the region. Small groups of German aircraft, primarily Ju-87 dive bombers and Fw-190 fighter bombers, carried out isolated raids on Soviet bridging sites, damaging several pontoons but failing to halt the crossings. Soviet air defense units, including 37mm and 85mm anti-aircraft batteries, downed multiple aircraft, further discouraging sustained Luftwaffe intervention. The command structures of both sides underwent rapid adjustments. On the Soviet side, Marshal Ivan Konev ordered the 3rd Guards Tank Army to prepare for a quick exploitation once enough units had crossed to establish operational depth. Tank brigades positioned east of the Vistula awaited completion of heavy pontoon bridges capable of supporting vehicles weighing up to 30 tons. Meanwhile, infantry elements expanded the perimeter to secure optimal crossing points and began clearing German observation posts that threatened the bridgehead. Soviet engineering battalions, the 254th and 257th, worked continuously to stabilize the bridges, reinforcing them with additional pontoons and constructing camouflage nets to reduce vulnerability from air attack. German command structures faced greater disruption. Communications between corps and divisional headquarters suffered from destroyed telephone lines and overburdened radio frequencies. Several headquarters, including that of the 20th Panzer Division, relocated multiple times in response to Soviet advances, complicating coordination. German commanders had to rely on hastily assembled Kampfgruppen, combining remnants of infantry units, armored detachments, and artillery batteries to hold key access roads. This fragmentation allowed the Soviets to exploit gaps in the early German defensive posture, expanding the bridgehead perimeter to approximately 12 kilometers by August 5th. In the civilian sphere, the opening phase brought widespread displacement. Polish residents near the crossing points reported heavy movement of troops and equipment through villages and farmlands. Soviet requisitions of buildings for command posts and medical stations disrupted local life, though many civilians had already fled due to earlier fighting. German forces retreating through the region also requisitioned livestock and transport assets, leaving communities with limited food supplies. Both armies restricted civilian movement, citing security concerns and the risk of espionage. The operational tempo on the Soviet side remained high during the initial phase as commanders sought to exploit German disorganization. Units of the 5th Guards Army captured several elevated positions around Baranów, Sandomierski, strengthening their defensive posture and securing observation advantages. Attempts to push armored units across the river began as engineering reports indicated that the first heavy pontoon bridge could support medium tanks. However, German artillery fire disrupted several early attempts, resulting in delays until additional bridges could be completed. German units launched their first coordinated counterattack on August 8th, involving elements from the 20th Panzer Division and attached armored units. The attack aimed to drive a wedge into the Soviet perimeter and isolate forward Soviet battalions before they could be reinforced. Although the attack achieved temporary gains along a 3-kilometer front and overran several Soviet positions, Soviet anti-tank artillery and reserves from the 13th Army halted further German progress. German reports indicated the loss of approximately 14 armored vehicles during the engagement, while Soviet losses included significant casualties among infantry defending the riverbank approaches. By the end of the opening phase, both sides had secured their initial positions, recognizing that the coming weeks would determine whether the bridgehead could be expanded into a major operational base or contained by German counterattacks. The events of these early days set the stage for a prolonged and intense struggle over control of one of the most strategically important footholds on the western bank of the Vistula. Soviet and German strategic planning for the Baranów Bridgehead intensified immediately after the initial crossings, as both sides recognized the importance of the position, not only for local operations, but for the future conduct of the war in southern Poland. For the Soviet First Ukrainian Front, the bridgehead represented a potential springboard for a major offensive toward Krakow, Katowice, and the industrial regions of Upper Silesia. Achieving this required expanding the bridgehead to sufficient width and depth to support sustained operations by mechanized and combined arms formations. For the German 4th Panzer Army and Army Group North Ukraine, preventing such expansion became a priority. Their objective was to contain the Soviet foothold, restrict its operational freedom, and, if possible, eliminate the bridgehead entirely before the Red Army could mass heavier forces on the western bank. Soviet strategic goals were shaped by high-level directives issued in late July and early August 1944, Stavka anticipated that once bridgeheads on the Vistula were secured, they could form the basis for future large-scale offensives capable of breaching German defenses in southeastern Poland. To this end, Konev's directives emphasized rapid reinforcement of the Baranów position. The 3rd Guards Tank Army, the 4th Tank Army, and multiple rifle corps were assigned to the operation, though their deployment depended on the timely completion of heavy pontoon bridges. Logistical planning required the coordinated movement of fuel, ammunition, food supplies, and engineering materials from depots located more than 150 kilometers to the east. Supply lines, strained during the pursuit phase, required reorganization to support static and semi-static operations along the river. Soviet military doctrine influenced planning decisions. The Red Army's experience from earlier river crossing operations, such as those conducted along the Dnieper in 1943, showed that shallow or narrow bridgeheads were vulnerable to German armored counterattacks. Accordingly, planners focused on rapidly increasing the bridgehead's depth to at least 10 to 12 kilometers and its width to more than 20 kilometers. This would require committing multiple infantry divisions to continuous offensive pressure on German positions. Engineering doctrine emphasized constructing redundancies, multiple bridges, reserve crossing points, and improvised routes for foot soldiers and ammunition carriers. Soviet propaganda materials of the time referenced the Vistula crossings as evidence of continued momentum following Operation Bagration. However, internal reports reflected a more cautious assessment. Logistics officers noted that the rapid advance had consumed more than 60% of the First Ukrainian Front's fuel stockpiles, and several divisions were operating with significantly reduced ammunition reserves. There were also concerns about German armored concentrations forming to the west. High Command therefore stressed the need to fortify defensive positions within the bridgehead and prepare for possible counterattacks before resuming offensive operations. German strategic goals were defined by their precarious position. Following the collapse of defensive lines across eastern Poland, Army Group North Ukraine sought to rebuild a coherent front along the Vistula, anchoring defensive positions around strongpoints such as Sandomierz, Mielec, and Tarnów. Eliminating, or at least containing, the Baranów Bridgehead became essential to preventing Soviet forces from launching a decisive offensive into central and southern Poland. German planning focused on assembling sufficient armored and infantry forces to conduct major counterattacks aimed at isolating the bridgehead from the riverbank and forcing the Soviets back east of the Vistula. Logistics played a critical role in shaping German planning. Supplies had to be transported from depots deep in the general government and from industrial centers in Upper Silesia. However, fuel shortages severely limited German operational flexibility. Reports from quartermaster units indicated that many divisions were receiving less than half their requested fuel allocations. Furthermore, armored units such as the 17th Panzer Division and the 20th Panzer Division were suffering from mechanical attrition accumulated during the retreat. These constraints limited the scale and frequency of counterattacks that could realistically be launched. German military doctrine emphasized forming mobile reserves capable of launching concentrated strikes against enemy bridgeheads. In theory, such counterattacks would involve synchronized artillery preparation, armored thrusts, and rapid exploitation by mechanized infantry. In practice, depleted unit strength and limited reserves restricted German operations to localized engagements. Nevertheless, German planners continued to develop proposals for larger efforts, including coordinated attacks involving multiple divisions supported by heavy artillery and elements of the Luftwaffe. The viability of such plans depended on stabilizing neighboring sectors and receiving reinforcements from other fronts. German intelligence assessments during this period attempted to evaluate the strength and composition of the Soviet forces within the bridgehead. However, limited aerial reconnaissance and gaps in ground observation produced inconsistent estimates. Reports sometimes overstated Soviet armor concentrations, while underestimating the number of infantry units already across the river. These inaccuracies influenced German planning, occasionally leading to delayed responses or misallocation of reserves. Civilian populations, though not direct participants in planning, were heavily affected by the strategic decisions of both armies. German evacuation orders in nearby towns prioritized military traffic, creating congestion on major roads and complicating military logistics. Soviet authorities, upon establishing control over local settlements, began organizing supply contributions from the civilian population, including food collection and requisitioning of materials to support engineering units. Civilians often found themselves caught between expectations from both sides, contributing to widespread disruption of daily life. A significant element shaping the opening stages of planning was the terrain around the Baranov region. The Vistula's western bank included forest patches, rolling agricultural fields, and several elevated positions offering observation advantages. Soviet planners sought to exploit these features by positioning artillery on high ground and creating defensive belts oriented against expected German armored approaches. German planners, conversely, aimed to use the open fields south of Tarnobrzeg for maneuver warfare, attempting to concentrate armored forces where terrain permitted broader movement. Both sides also integrated deception measures into their planning. Soviet engineers constructed dummy crossing points and false artillery positions to draw German artillery fire away from actual bridges. German forces used smokescreens during repositioning of armor and artillery to conceal their movements from Soviet aerial observation. As the planning phase concluded and both sides finalized their preparations, the Baranov Bridgehead transitioned into one of the most contested and strategically significant zones on the Vistula. The decisions made during this stage shaped the intensity and scale of the battles that followed, ultimately determining how both armies would commit their strength to 6 months of brutal confrontation. The first major clashes around the Baranov Bridgehead unfolded in the second week of August 1944, as Soviet forces pushed outward to secure tactical depth, and German units launched counterattacks aimed at compressing or eliminating the foothold before it could solidify. These engagements occurred along a fragmented front, with multiple local battles developing simultaneously across villages, forest belts, and ridgelines surrounding Baranov, Sandomierski. The lack of fully established defensive structures on either side contributed to rapidly shifting territorial gains and losses, while the intensity of fighting increased as both armies committed more units to the struggle. Soviet spearheads of the 5th Guards Army and elements of the 13th Army continued their westward push from the riverbanks, targeting German positions in the villages of Gierlachov, Kempie, and Dombrovica. These settlements occupied tactically important ground, including road junctions that controlled access to the deeper interior of the western bank. The Soviets deployed rifle divisions supported by regimental artillery, mortar batteries, and a limited number of self-propelled guns available before heavier equipment could be ferried across. The early Soviet offensive actions aimed to create a contiguous line and prevent German forces from isolating the assault units scattered across the initial perimeter. German forces, primarily elements of the 20th Panzer Division, the 17th Panzer Division, and several infantry Kampfgruppen assembled from retreating units, initiated a series of counterattacks. The first notable German effort occurred on August 9th, when a combined armored infantry force attempted to penetrate the Soviet lines north of Tarnobrzeg. The German attack, supported by approximately 20 to 25 tanks and assault guns, drove an initial wedge into Soviet forward positions and forced the withdrawal of several rifle battalions. German reports indicate that artillery fire from batteries positioned west of Milek provided covering bombardment aimed at disrupting Soviet reserves. However, Soviet anti-tank artillery, including 45mm and 76mm guns, inflicted losses that halted further German gains. Simultaneously, clashes erupted along the southern edge of the bridgehead as German commanders attempted to contain Soviet expansion toward the Wisłoka River. Kampfgruppen, formed from the remnants of the 72nd Infantry Division and reinforced by assault guns, launched localized attacks to retake small forest sectors and elevated terrain features. Soviet defensive actions relied heavily on mortar concentrations and flexible rifle platoon maneuvering, compensating for the limited availability of tanks during the early stages of the fighting. These engagements often resulted in territory changing hands multiple times within a single day, as both sides sought to secure tactically advantageous terrain. Civilian populations in the affected areas suffered immediate consequences as combat intensified around their villages. Many residents fled deeper into rural zones or toward towns under temporary German control. Homes, barns, and public buildings were converted into field hospitals, ammunition depots, or temporary command posts. Reports from local authorities recorded widespread destruction of property, including the burning of farm structures struck by artillery shells. Civilians attempting to retrieve belongings or livestock were frequently caught in crossfire, contributing to rising non-combatant casualties during the opening battles. The pace of fighting increased as Soviet engineering units managed to complete additional pontoon bridges capable of supporting light and medium armored vehicles. By mid-August, elements of the 3rd Guards Tank Army began crossing the Vistula, reinforcing the infantry already engaged on the western bank. Early tank engagements occurred near the village of Osiek, where the Soviets attempted to push armored reconnaissance units forward to probe German defenses. German anti-tank units, including 75mm pack guns and mobile tank destroyers such as Marder III vehicles, engaged these Soviet forces, resulting in several armored losses on both sides. The first unexpected turning point came when Soviet units successfully captured Hill 204, a dominant elevation overlooking several approach routes to the bridgehead. German defenders, primarily from the 68th Infantry Division, had attempted to hold the ridge but were outnumbered and forced to withdraw after sustained artillery bombardment. Soviet control of the hill allowed the placement of forward observation posts that improved the accuracy of artillery fire across multiple sectors. German after-action reports acknowledged the importance of the position, noting that its loss created difficulties in coordinating counterattacks. German forces responded with increased determination, launching several nighttime counterattacks intended to disrupt Soviet consolidation efforts. One significant engagement occurred on August 14th, when German units supported by assault guns conducted a night maneuver aimed at breaking through Soviet lines along the northern sector of the bridgehead. The attack initially achieved surprise, overrunning several Soviet trenches. However, Soviet reserve battalions, alerted by flares and communication signals, counterattacked with coordinated mortar and small arms fire, eventually restoring the defensive positions by dawn. Air operations remained limited, but not insignificant. The Luftwaffe, operating under fuel restrictions and reduced operational strength, conducted small-scale sorties intended to disrupt Soviet supply and reinforcement routes leading to the bridges. Ju-87s targeted pontoon bridges and troop concentrations, but faced heavy Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Several aircraft were lost, reducing the Luftwaffe's ability to influence the battle. Soviet air support, somewhat delayed due to logistical issues, grew more effective as forward airfields became operational. Il-2 ground attack aircraft executed strikes against German armored formations, contributing to localized Soviet tactical successes. Throughout the opening clashes, morale varied considerably among the combatants. Soviet troops, buoyed by recent successes during Operation Bagration, maintained confidence despite heavy casualties and the difficulty of establishing defensive positions on newly captured terrain. German morale was mixed. While some veterans of the armored divisions displayed resilience, infantry formations composed of retreating remnants expressed concern over the strength and momentum of Soviet forces. Nonetheless, German command emphasized the necessity of holding the line to prevent the bridgehead from becoming an operational base for future Soviet offensives. By the end of August's early fighting, the Baranov Bridgehead had become a contested zone defined by fluid engagements, shifting territorial control, and rapidly escalating commitments from both armies. The first engagement set the tone for a prolonged confrontation, during which both sides sought to shape the battlefield before larger operations could unfold in the months ahead. The escalation phase of the fighting around the Baranov Bridgehead began in late August 1944 and continued through September, as both the Soviet 1st Ukrainian Front and the German 4th Panzer Army committed increasingly larger formations to the expanding battles. What had started as local clashes grew into a sustained campaign involving multiple divisions, heavy artillery, and the first large-scale armored operations on both sides. The contested terrain along the western bank of the Vistula became a zone of constant pressure, with both armies adjusting their plans in response to new challenges involving manpower shortages, shifting weather patterns, and logistical strain. One of the earliest signs of escalation came from the German side, which organized a series of coordinated counterattacks aimed at disrupting Soviet consolidation. Reinforcements arrived gradually, including elements of the 3rd Panzer Division, the 16th Panzer Division, and the 101st Jaeger Division. Though well below full strength, many divisions operated at 40 to 60% of authorized manpower. They still possessed enough armored vehicles and artillery to mount significant offensive efforts. Between August 20th and August 30th, German units launched repeated thrusts toward the northern and southern edges of the bridgehead, attempting to compress the Soviet perimeter and regain control of high ground lost earlier in the month. These counterattacks frequently resulted in intense fighting around key villages, including Vilcha Vola, Kempie, and Słupiec. German armored spearheads, supported by self-propelled guns such as Stu-G3s and Jagdpanzer IVs, attempted to break through Soviet positions, but the Soviets had strengthened their defenses by expanding anti-tank belts, deploying additional artillery battalions, and reinforcing rifle divisions with machine gun companies. As casualties mounted, German commanders increasingly relied on ad hoc formations, Kampfgruppen assembled from remaining infantry, artillery remnants, and armored detachments to sustain offensive pressure. Terrain and weather added significant complications to the intensifying conflict. Heavy rains struck the region in early September, turning agricultural fields into deep mud and limiting the maneuverability of armored vehicles. German after-action reports noted that several tanks and assault guns became immobilized in waterlogged terrain, making them vulnerable to Soviet artillery fire. Soviet units faced similar challenges, with supply trucks and ammunition wagons struggling to traverse narrow, rutted roads that deteriorated under constant traffic. Engineering battalions on both sides attempted to improve routes using gravel, wooden planks, and makeshift reinforcements, but these efforts were often insufficient given the volume of logistical traffic. Political tensions accompanied these military developments. In German high command circles, debates intensified over whether to commit additional reserves to attempt a decisive counteroffensive at Baranov, or to redirect forces to other critical fronts, including Hungary and East Prussia. Ultimately, strategic necessity forced a compromise. Enough units were sent to continue pressure on the bridgehead, but not enough to mount a comprehensive operation capable of eliminating it. This decision reflected the broader strain on German military resources as the front lines contracted across Eastern Europe. On the Soviet side, political objectives intertwined with operational goals. Securing the Baranov Bridgehead became a priority for the Soviet leadership, not only for strategic reasons, but also because the Vistula crossings symbolized the Red Army's advance into Poland. Reports circulated within Soviet command structures emphasized the need to demonstrate continued momentum following Operation Bagration. However, logistical difficulties and the growing concentration of German forces forced Soviet planners to adjust their expectations. Offensive operations were slowed, and efforts shifted towards strengthening defensive positions and preparing for future large-scale operations rather than immediate breakthroughs. As fighting escalated, the impact on civilians intensified. Villages caught between advancing and retreating forces experienced systematic destruction. Artillery bombardments led to the collapse of infrastructure, including bridges, barns, and residential homes. Civilians attempting to flee the contested area often found themselves caught between the lines or subjected to questioning and searches by either army. Several villages became depopulated entirely, their residents displaced into forests or toward urban centers such as Tarnoberzeg or Rzeszów. German authorities instituted strict movement controls, while Soviet units requisitioned supplies, livestock, and equipment to support frontline troops. September saw some of the most violent engagements to date. One notable clash occurred near Osijek on September 10th, when German forces launched a three-pronged attack designed to exploit what they believed was a weakly defended sector of the Soviet line. Supported by artillery barrages, the Germans penetrated up to 3 kilometers into the Soviet perimeter before Soviet reserves from the 13th Army counterattacked. The battle lasted more than 18 hours, with both sides committing substantial forces. German reports documented the loss of over a dozen armored vehicles, while Soviet casualty lists for the day reflected heavy losses in infantry units. The sector ultimately returned to Soviet control, though at significant cost. Air operations also escalated during this phase, though the Luftwaffe remained constrained by fuel shortages and reduced operational strength. Small formations of German aircraft conducted targeted strikes on Soviet artillery positions and bridgehead supply routes. These attacks occasionally disrupted Soviet logistics, but sustained air pressure proved impossible to maintain. The Soviet Air Force increased its activity, deploying Il-2 ground attack aircraft to strike German concentrations west of the bridgehead. These missions contributed to the attrition of German armored units and complicated German efforts to build momentum in their counterattacks. The psychological burden of prolonged combat increasingly affected both armies. German units, fighting defensively across a broad front while attempting offensive thrusts at Baranov, reported growing fatigue. Commanders noted declining effectiveness in some infantry battalions due to sustained casualties and inadequate reinforcements. Soviet troops, though buoyed by their strategic successes earlier in the summer, faced the strain of repeated German counterattacks and the constant requirement to fortify their positions against armored assaults. Letters, diaries, and internal reports from both sides indicate rising exhaustion, reflecting the cumulative toll of the battles. By the end of September, the escalating engagements had transformed the Baranov Bridgehead from a temporary Soviet foothold into a fortified and deeply contested operational zone. Neither side had achieved decisive gains. The Soviet perimeter held, but German counterattacks continued to threaten its stability. Territorial shifts remained localized, with frontage changing hands frequently. The stage was now set for the heavy and sustained battles that would define the peak phase of the campaign in the months that followed. By October 1944, the Baranov Bridgehead had evolved into one of the most heavily fortified and bitterly contested sectors of the entire Vistula front. Both the Soviet First Ukrainian Front and the German Fourth Panzer Army recognized that the coming months would determine whether the bridgehead would become a launching point for a Soviet strategic breakthrough, or whether German forces could contain it long enough to stabilize the collapsing front lines elsewhere. As autumn turned to winter, the fighting reached its peak intensity. Large-scale assaults, dense artillery bombardments, prolonged positional battles, and continuous attritional engagements defined this phase, placing enormous strain on the troops and commanders on both sides. Soviet forces began the peak phase by reinforcing the bridgehead with additional infantry, artillery, and armored units. The 3rd Guards Tank Army completed its crossing into the perimeter, bringing dozens of T-34s, Su-85s, and supporting vehicles into the contested zone. To accommodate this buildup, Soviet engineering formations expanded and strengthened the pontoon bridges, constructing layered redundancy to ensure uninterrupted supply flow. According to internal Soviet reports, by mid-October, the bridgehead contained more than 100,000 Soviet personnel, supported by several hundred artillery pieces and a growing armored reserve. This concentration allowed the Soviets to begin launching coordinated assaults against German positions that had resisted earlier attempts to expand the perimeter. German High Command responded by concentrating some of its remaining armored reserves in the region. Elements of the 3rd Panzer Division, the 16th Panzer Division, the 17th Panzer Division, and remnants of the 20th Panzer Division were all committed to operations around Baranov. These formations, while depleted and operating with fewer than 60 operational tanks across multiple divisions, remained capable of executing local counterattacks. German defensive preparations also intensified. Trenches, anti-tank obstacles, fortified houses, and interconnected firing positions were constructed across the approaches to Tarnoberzeg and Mielek. The German goal was to prevent Soviet forces from breaking out into open terrain where their numerical and mechanized superiority could be fully exploited. Some of the heaviest fighting occurred around the villages of Slupiec, Vola Baranovska, and Gierlakov, where German defenses created layered belts of machine gun positions and concealed anti-tank guns. Soviet attempts to break these lines often involved coordinated infantry-artillery assaults designed to overwhelm German forward positions. Artillery units on both sides engaged in continuous duels, with Soviet batteries firing thousands of shells daily to suppress German defenders. German artillery, supported by spotters positioned on higher ground west of the bridgehead, responded with accurate fire that slowed Soviet advances and inflicted heavy casualties. The terrain played a decisive role in shaping the peak fighting. Open fields turned to mud under repeated shelling and worsening weather conditions. Tanks and trucks often became bogged down, forcing Soviet infantry to cover long distances on foot. Forest patches offered concealment, but also created choke points that German defenders exploited with well-positioned machine gun nests. Riverbanks and wetlands limited maneuverability, funneling attacks into predictable corridors that German defenders tried to hold at all costs. Meanwhile, Soviet units attempted to use the cover of forests and depressions in the landscape to conceal their buildup before launching renewed attacks. Civilian suffering intensified as the peak battles unfolded. Many villages became completely uninhabitable, their structures destroyed by artillery or repurposed as defensive positions. Polish civilians who had remained in the region now faced extreme shortages of food, exposure to harsh weather, and the constant risk of accidental or deliberate harm from both armies. Reports from local administrative bodies recorded the destruction of over 60% of residential buildings in certain sectors and the displacement of thousands of civilians toward Rzeszów, Kraków, or makeshift shelters in forests. Agricultural production in the region collapsed entirely, complicating both civilian survival and military requisitioning. One of the defining features of the peak phase was the scale of German armored counterattacks. In late October, the 3rd Panzer Division launched a concentrated assault on the northern sector of the bridgehead, attempting to encircle Soviet units positioned around Kępie and Wilcza Wola. Supported by artillery and assault guns, German tanks penetrated up to 4 kilometers into Soviet defenses before encountering stiff resistance. Soviet anti-tank artillery, supported by newly arrived T-34 units, halted the advance after several hours of intense fighting. German after-action reports indicate the loss of at least 10 tanks during this engagement, while Soviet casualty records document heavy losses among forward rifle battalions. Soviet commanders, recognizing the persistent threat posed by German counterattacks, shifted to a strategy of layered defense combined with limited offensives aimed at wearing down German reserves. This approach relied heavily on artillery concentrations, mortar fire, and localized infantry assaults. The goal was not immediate breakthrough, but rather progressive erosion of German unit strength. As the fighting continued into November, evidence of attrition became increasingly visible. German divisions reported severe shortages of infantry replacements, with many battalions reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength. Soviet units, too, faced exhaustion and significant losses, though their ability to rotate divisions across the bridgehead gave them greater long-term sustainability. Weather conditions grew increasingly harsh as winter approached. By late November, temperatures dropped significantly, complicating mobility and increasing the strain on soldiers. Weapons malfunctioned more frequently, and supply lines endured delays as ice and mud slowed the movement of ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. Frostbite, illness, and exposure became major concerns for both armies, adding another layer of suffering to an already grueling campaign. Despite the intensity of the fighting, the front lines shifted only marginally during the peak phase. The Soviets achieved incremental gains in several sectors, expanding the bridgehead by a few kilometers, but failed to achieve a decisive breakout. German forces, though unable to eliminate the bridgehead, succeeded in containing it within a defined perimeter. This dynamic created a temporary equilibrium, marked by constant attrition rather than dramatic movement. Both sides recognized that the outcome of the broader war would determine whether the Baranów Bridgehead would remain a static battlefield or become the launching point for a decisive offensive. By the end of December 1944, the Baranów Bridgehead had become a hardened battlefield, shaped by months of relentless combat. The peak of the campaign demonstrated the extent to which both armies were willing to commit their remaining strength to control the Vistula corridor. The stage was now set for the operations that would ultimately decide the fate of the bridgehead in the months to come. As winter settled over the Vistula in December 1944, the Baranów Bridgehead entered a new phase defined by resistance, adaptation, and constant improvisation from both Soviet and German forces. After months of brutal clashes, neither side possessed the strength for decisive breakthroughs, yet neither could afford to relinquish pressure. This period was characterized by sustained local offensives, defensive reorganization, partisan activity in the surrounding hinterland, and the psychological toll of prolonged combat under harsh winter conditions. The bridgehead, once a fluid battleground, had become a fortified zone where innovation and endurance shaped daily survival. Soviet forces adapted their strategy to the realities of winter warfare, recognizing that major mechanized operations were nearly impossible across frozen and snow-covered terrain. Soviet commanders reorganized their deployment to emphasize fortified defense while conducting limited targeted assaults. Rifle divisions dug deep trench systems reinforced with logs and packed snow. Engineers constructed anti-tank positions designed to withstand repeated German probing attacks. Additional minefields were laid in concentric rings, creating layered defenses that made German armored thrusts increasingly costly. Soviet artillery, now more plentiful within the bridgehead, thanks to months of logistical buildup, played a central role in maintaining pressure on German positions. Batteries rotated frequently to avoid counter-battery fire, while forward observers braved freezing conditions to maintain surveillance of German movements. Particularly notable was the Soviet use of night assaults and reconnaissance in force. Small groups of scouts, supported by mortar teams, probed German lines to capture prisoners and gather intelligence. These operations informed Soviet adjustments in deployment, enabling commanders to identify weak points, overstretched German sectors, or battalions suffering from acute manpower shortages. Internal reports from the 5th Guards Army documented numerous instances where such intelligence activities helped identify opportunities for small but meaningful territorial gains, even during the harshest weeks of winter. German forces, meanwhile, faced increasing logistical and manpower constraints. By December, most divisions engaged around Baranów had experienced continuous combat for 4 to 5 months, leaving infantry companies dramatically under strength. German after-action reports recorded battalions reduced to 120 to 150 men, barely a third of their authorized strength. To compensate, German commanders reorganized units into Kampfgruppen, merging remnants of several companies or battalions into flexible but fragile formations. These improvised units often combined infantry, engineers, artillery crews, and a small number of armored vehicles into single tactical entities capable of responding to localized Soviet attacks. Adaptation also appeared in German defensive tactics, recognizing that the Soviets were increasingly capable of repelling daylight armored thrusts. German forces shifted to nighttime infiltration attempts, limited spoiling attacks, and the use of mortar and Nebelwerfer bombardments to disrupt Soviet positions. These actions rarely achieved major territorial gains, but slowed Soviet improvements to fortifications, forced constant troop rotation, and contributed to attrition within the bridgehead. Partisan activity became a significant factor during this period, especially in areas west and south of the bridgehead. Polish resistance units, operating in forests and remote villages, targeted German supply convoys, railway lines, and communication routes. Their operations strained German logistics, forcing the deployment of rear security battalions that were increasingly needed at the front. Soviet forces inside the bridgehead benefited indirectly from this activity, as attacks on German supply infrastructure reduced the flow of ammunition and fuel to frontline positions. German reports from late 1944 record dozens of partisan attacks disrupting movements near Tarnobrzeg, Rzeszów, and Mielec, further complicating efforts to reinforce units facing the bridgehead. The psychological toll on both armies intensified during this phase. Diaries, internal reports, and soldiers' correspondence, where preserved, reflect the grinding nature of the campaign. German soldiers expressed exhaustion from constant artillery harassment and the cold, while Soviet troops noted the difficulty of maintaining morale amid static fighting, limited shelter, and the relentless German probing attacks. The harsh weather compounded these challenges. Temperatures often fell below -10 degrees Celsius, freezing weapons, immobilizing trucks, and forcing troops to rely on makeshift stoves and dugouts for warmth. Frostbite cases increased dramatically in both armies, reducing combat effectiveness even without direct battlefield losses. Logistical adaptation proved crucial. Soviet supply officers implemented new measures to maintain the flow of ammunition, food, and winter clothing into the bridgehead. Sled convoys replaced trucks along some supply routes. Improvised packaging insulated artillery shells against freezing temperatures. German logistics were more strained. Fuel shortages forced armored units to limit movement, strictly to counterattack needs or defensive repositioning. Vehicles were cannibalized for parts, and ammunition stocks dwindled in several sectors. Reports from the German 3rd Panzer Division indicate days when artillery batteries fired fewer than 20 rounds due to limited supply. Innovation extended to engineering efforts. Soviet engineers constructed improved bunkers, communication trenches, and observation posts designed to withstand both artillery and cold. German engineers reinforced existing positions, installed additional wire obstacles, and built hidden firing points for machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Both sides used camouflage extensively to conceal positions in snowy terrain, relying on white cloth, winter smocks, and covered dugouts. Civilian life during this period reflected deep social and economic disruption. Many villages remained abandoned, while others hosted makeshift field hospitals or supply depots. Civilians struggled to find food as agricultural stores were exhausted or requisitioned. Local populations also served as a source of intelligence for both armies, though at great personal risk. Winter intensified shortages, with reports of families relying on forest foraging or aid from Soviet field kitchens where permitted. By late December and early January 1945, it became clear that neither side would achieve major territorial gains before spring. The Baranów Bridgehead had transformed into a heavily fortified Soviet stronghold, while German forces clung to their surrounding positions despite mounting losses. The operational environment stabilized into a tense stalemate, with each army preparing for the eventual offensive that would determine the bridgehead's ultimate fate. The turning point in the struggle for the Baranów Bridgehead emerged in early January 1945, as shifting strategic priorities and accumulating attrition altered the balance of power irreversibly. What had been a months-long stalemate, defined by positional fighting, localized offensives, and attritional pressure, gave way to a fundamental change in momentum. The Soviet First Ukrainian Front completed preparations for a massive winter offensive aimed not merely at maintaining the bridgehead, but at transforming it into the primary launching point for a deep strategic breakthrough into southern Poland, Upper Silesia, and ultimately toward the German heartland. Simultaneously, German forces, weakened by cumulative losses, logistical collapse, and reallocation of reserves to Hungary, found themselves unable to mount the level of resistance they had sustained in previous months. The convergence of these factors marked the decisive turning point that would determine the fate of the bridgehead and the front as a whole. The key catalyst was the Soviet decision, authorized by Stavka in late December 1944, to designate the Baranów Bridgehead as one of the two principal starting points for the Vistula-Oder offensive. Intelligence, engineering, and logistical preparations accelerated substantially. Soviet engineers expanded pontoon capacity, reinforcing bridges to sustain the movement of hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and supply trucks. Ammunition stockpiles were increased dramatically, with some sectors receiving more than triple their previous monthly allocations. Fuel reserves were dispersed across concealed depots throughout the bridgehead. Fresh divisions, including rifle corps, artillery units, and tank brigades, were quietly relocated to staging positions under cover of darkness and camouflage, minimizing German awareness of the buildup. The Germans, meanwhile, entered the new year facing severe operational disadvantages. Army Group A, which oversaw the sector, was overextended along the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front. High Command diverted multiple armored formations, including significant elements of the 6th Panzer Army, to Hungary for Operation Conrad, intended to relieve the encircled garrison of Budapest. This decision weakened the German ability to reinforce the Vistula line. Reports from the 4th Panzer Army indicated that several divisions facing the Baranów Bridgehead had fallen to critically low strength, with infantry battalions often reduced to fewer than 100 combat-ready soldiers. Artillery ammunition shortages further eroded defensive capability, and fuel allocations dropped to levels insufficient for sustained maneuver operations. A crucial turning point also stemmed from the transformation of Soviet operational doctrine in the bridgehead. Rather than continuing incremental assaults aimed at widening the perimeter, Soviet commanders now shifted toward large-scale operational planning. The 3rd Guards Tank Army and 4th Tank Army were brought to full combat readiness, their vehicles serviced and winter-prepared. Rifle divisions rotated out exhausted units and replaced them with fresher formations. Artillery was reorganized into concentrated artillery shock groups, designed to deliver overwhelming fire in specific breakthrough sectors. Soviet reconnaissance in force intensified in early January, identifying weak points in the German line around Wola Baranowska, Staszów, and Kurozwenki. These probes confirmed that German defenses, though still coherent, lacked the depth and reserves necessary to withstand a major coordinated assault. Weather conditions played an unexpected but significant role in shaping the turning point. A hard freeze in the opening days of January solidified the ground, eliminating the mud conditions that had previously restricted mechanized movement. This allowed Soviet commanders to finalize plans for deploying multiple tank corps simultaneously. Even more critically, the Vistula's surface ice thickened but did not reach a level that threatened pontoon integrity, creating an optimal environment for the offensive. Ground mobility improved while river crossings remained stable. German commanders recognized the danger, but lacked the operational reserves to exploit the temporary freeze for counteraction. Civilian dynamics also contributed to the shift in momentum. As Soviet control within the bridgehead solidified, local Polish administrative structures began cooperating more openly with Soviet authorities, enabling efficient requisitioning of wagons, horses, and shelter for supply teams. Conversely, German civilian evacuation from nearby towns intensified, signaling declining confidence in the sustainability of defensive positions. Traffic jams on supply roads, caused by both retreating civilians and military logistics, created additional delays for German reinforcements moving toward the front. German intelligence assessments during this period underestimated the scale of Soviet preparations. Despite increased Soviet nighttime traffic, strict radio silence and extensive camouflage measures limited German ability to detect the buildup. Luftwaffe reconnaissance sorties, hampered by poor weather and insufficient aircraft, identified some Soviet troop concentrations, but failed to grasp the full magnitude of the impending offensive. As a result, German High Command did not anticipate the timing or scale of the Soviet breakthrough that the bridgehead would soon enable. Another decisive factor was the psychological erosion within German units. Months of strain, combined with harsh winter conditions and deteriorating supply lines, reduced combat readiness across the divisions. Reports from regimental commanders documented falling morale, hunger, sickness, and rising desertion rates from rear area units. Conversely, the Soviet troops preparing for the offensive experienced a rise in morale due to the promise of a decisive operation designed to liberate Polish territory and advance deep into German-held areas. By January 10, 1945, all indicators pointed toward an imminent, large-scale Soviet offensive. German defenses, already weakened, were about to face unprecedented concentrations of artillery, armor, and infantry. The Soviet buildup reached its final stages, and commanders issued sealed operational orders to be opened shortly before the assault. Thus, the turning point in the Baranów Bridgehead campaign occurred not through a single dramatic battle, but through a cumulative and irreversible shift in relative strength, strategic priorities, and operational capability. The bridgehead, once merely a contested foothold, had transformed into a fully developed Soviet staging area, poised to launch one of the most significant offensives of the Eastern Front. The German forces surrounding it, exhausted and overstretched, stood on the brink of collapse as the momentum tilted decisively in favor of the Red Army. The aftermath of the Baranov Bridgehead campaign unfolded rapidly and decisively in mid-January 1945 as the Soviet First Ukrainian Front launched the full-scale Vistula-Oder offensive. Overnight, the bridgehead, fortified for 6 months, stocked with ammunition, and crowded with mechanized formations, shifted from a defensive stronghold to the epicenter of one of the most dramatic breakthroughs of the Eastern Front. What followed was the collapse of the German defensive system along the Vistula, the retreat of exhausted formations who could no longer sustain coherent resistance, and the transformation of the regional landscape through destruction, forced movement, and profound humanitarian crises. The Soviet assault began at dawn on January 12, 1945, with one of the largest artillery barrages conducted in the sector to date. Thousands of guns, including heavy 152mm and 203mm pieces, opened fire simultaneously along a broad frontage. Their targets included German forward trenches, artillery batteries, supply points, headquarters, and communication hubs. The density of the bombardment disrupted German lines almost immediately. Reports from the 4th Panzer Army noted widespread losses in field telephone networks, destroyed command posts, and fragmentation of infantry companies that struggled to regroup under sustained fire. Soviet assault battalions advanced behind the barrage, quickly overrunning German forward positions that had already suffered months of attrition. As rifle divisions broke through the 1st German defensive belt, mechanized forces began to move. The 3rd Guards Tank Army and 4th Tank Army crossed from their concealed staging areas and pushed westward in coordinated thrusts. Their rapid movement was made possible by the frozen ground, which allowed tanks and supply vehicles to maneuver across terrain previously inaccessible due to mud. Soviet armored spearheads quickly penetrated 10 to 15 kilometers beyond the bridgehead perimeter, bypassing strongpoints and isolating pockets of German defenders. German reports from units engaged near Stazov and Powanets recorded instances of encirclement within the first 24 hours of the offensive. The German retreat unfolded unevenly. Some formations, such as elements of the 3rd and 17th Panzer Divisions, attempted organized withdrawals and counterattacks to delay Soviet breakthroughs. However, these efforts were hampered by shortages of fuel and ammunition. Panzer battalions often fielded only a handful of operational vehicles. In several sectors, infantry battalions lacked adequate anti-tank capabilities to resist Soviet armor. Units caught in the initial breakthrough either retreated in disorganized fashion or were destroyed in place. Kampfgruppen assembled hastily to stabilize the line collapsed under pressure from Soviet mechanized corps, advancing with overwhelming numerical superiority. The collapse of German defense lines triggered widespread disintegration of command structures. Corps and divisional headquarters frequently lost contact with subordinate units as communication lines were severed by artillery or cut off by advancing Soviet columns. Some German commanders reported receiving conflicting orders: withdraw to secondary defensive lines, hold current positions, or attempt local counterattacks. In practice, few options remained viable. The speed of the Soviet advance rendered most planned defensive positions untenable before German forces could reach them. By January 14th, large segments of the German 4th Panzer Army were in full retreat toward the Nida and Dunajec rivers. The humanitarian consequences of the breakthrough were significant. Civilians in the surrounding region, having endured months of static fighting, now faced sudden and chaotic shifts in control. The rapid Soviet advance created waves of displacement as German authorities ordered evacuations of administrative personnel, families of military staff, and civilians deemed at risk of reprisal. Columns of refugees clogged roads, slowing German military traffic. Many residents abandoned homes without time to secure food or belongings, relying on makeshift carts, livestock, or simply traveling on foot through freezing conditions. Reports from local Polish sources describe entire villages moving westward under bombardment, while others remained in place and sought shelter during the fighting. Inside the bridgehead, Soviet medical units immediately began processing casualties from the opening days of the offensive. Field hospitals established months earlier now expanded their operations, treating wounded soldiers and civilians caught near the front. The intense pace of the offensive strained medical and logistical services, but the overall momentum of the Soviet advance remained unbroken. Commanders prioritized speed over consolidation, directing tank armies to advance deeply into German rear areas before defenders could re-establish coherent lines. As the Soviet offensive widened, German units attempted to regroup along the Nita River and in the direction of Kielce. However, Soviet armored units reached these areas within days, overrunning key junctions and creating large pockets of isolated German formations. The German withdrawal increasingly resembled a rout. Supply depots were abandoned or destroyed, fuel was burned or left behind, and bridges were demolished in an effort to slow the Soviet pursuit. However, Soviet engineers and mobile infantry units quickly restored crossings or found alternative routes, maintaining relentless pressure on retreating forces. The collapse of German positions around the Baranov Bridgehead had immediate operational repercussions. The Soviets exploited the breakthrough by advancing rapidly toward Krakow, which fell with limited resistance on January 19th. Simultaneously, Soviet units pushed deep into Upper Silesia, threatening critical industrial centers that had long served as the backbone of German war production. The fall of the Baranov sector opened the path for Soviet forces to reach the Oder River within weeks, dramatically altering the strategic landscape of the Eastern Front. Civilian infrastructure in the Baranov region suffered extensive damage during these events. Bridges, roads, and rail lines, already degraded by months of fighting, were further destroyed during the German withdrawal. Agricultural fields were littered with burned-out vehicles, collapsed buildings, and unexploded ordnance. In the weeks that followed, local populations attempted to return to their homes, only to find widespread devastation, shortages of food, and limited access to medical care. Soviet authorities began establishing interim administrative structures to restore order, but the devastation of the region ensured that recovery would be slow and challenging. By late January 1945, combat operations around the Baranov Bridgehead had effectively concluded. German forces had retreated or been destroyed, Soviet armies had advanced far to the west, and the once contested bridgehead became primarily a logistical and transit zone for Soviet units pushing toward the Oder. The operational consequences of its collapse were decisive. The bridgehead had served as the launching point for one of the most rapid and consequential offensives of the war, contributing directly to the disintegration of German defenses in southern Poland and altering the trajectory of the final months of the conflict. The long-term legacy of the Baranov Bridgehead extends far beyond the 6 months of intense fighting that defined its existence on the Vistula. Its significance lies not only in the military outcomes it enabled, but also in the political, cultural, and historical implications that shaped interpretations of the Eastern Front for decades afterward. The bridgehead stands as a central case study in the evolution of Soviet operational art, the limits of German defensive strategy in the late war period, the human cost of prolonged positional warfare, and the lasting impact of occupation and liberation on local populations. Understanding its legacy requires assessing its influence on the broader war, the region it reshaped, and the ways in which historians, governments, and communities have remembered or forgotten it. Militarily, the Baranov Bridgehead became one of the critical anchor points for the Soviet winter campaign of 1945. It served as the primary launching ground for the Vistula-Oder offensive, which achieved a strategic breakthrough in less than 3 weeks and carried Soviet forces from central Poland to the outskirts of Berlin. The ability to maintain, reinforce, and expand the bridgehead during the second half of 1944 gave the Soviet command a rare opportunity to concentrate overwhelming mechanized and artillery forces west of a major natural barrier without facing an immediate threat of dislodgement. This represented a pivotal shift in operational dynamics. Prior Soviet offensives had often required extensive preparation east of river lines, forcing costly and time-consuming crossings under fire. The Baranov Bridgehead eliminated that constraint and allowed Soviet planners to design an offensive that maximized mobility, firepower, and surprise. For the German military, the legacy of Baranov reflects the cumulative failures of late-war defensive doctrine. Despite months of effort, several counterattacks, and the commitment of multiple panzer divisions, German forces were unable to eliminate the Soviet foothold. The bridgehead exposed fundamental limitations in German strategy at this stage of the war. Insufficient reserves, declining mobility caused by fuel shortages, and weakened infantry formations incapable of sustained defensive operations. The inability to retake the bridgehead became a symbol of the Wehrmacht's diminishing operational capacity. It demonstrated the growing mismatch between German intentions, such as rebuilding a continuous Vistula defensive line, and the rapidly deteriorating reality of their available manpower, supplies, and mobility. Politically, the control of the bridgehead was significant for both sides. For the Soviets, establishing and expanding the bridgehead provided tangible evidence of their liberation of Polish territory, following the destruction of German control in the east. It strengthened Soviet political influence in the region, particularly as provisional administrative structures were established in liberated villages. The advance from the bridgehead contributed directly to the Soviet arrival in Krakow, Silesia, and eventually into German territory, shaping the political geography that would prevail after the war. Moreover, the success of the offensive that originated at Baranov reinforced Soviet claims of military superiority during the critical period of post-war diplomatic realignment. The legacy for local civilian populations was multifaceted. The region around Baranów-Sandomierski experienced extensive destruction due to prolonged artillery duels, repeated German counterattacks, and Soviet assaults. Agricultural land was disrupted. Forests were scarred by shelling, and many villages suffered partial or complete destruction. The months of occupation, shifting control, and frontline proximity left long-lasting economic consequences. After the war, reconstruction efforts were slow, reflecting broader challenges faced across eastern Poland. Civilians who returned to devastated villages faced shortages of food, tools, livestock, and shelter. The social disruptions caused by evacuation, casualties, requisitioning, and property destruction left profound marks on the community that endured well into the post-war years. From a broader historical perspective, the Baranov Bridgehead occupies a significant position in scholarship on Eastern Front military strategy. It demonstrates the Red Army's growing mastery of combined arms operations, sustained logistical management, and the ability to execute deep offensive operations. Historians examining Soviet operational art often highlight the bridgehead as a crucial example of how Soviet forces used positional advantages, engineering capabilities, and logistical buildup to prepare for large-scale breakthroughs. The success at Baranov is frequently compared to earlier Soviet bridgehead operations on the Dnieper, providing insight into the evolution of Soviet doctrine between 1943 and 1945. German military historians frequently treat the Baranov campaign as a case study in the challenges faced by late-war armored divisions. The attrition suffered by the 3rd, 16th, and 17th Panzer Divisions during attempts to eliminate the bridgehead underscores the limitations of German armored warfare in environments characterized by insufficient fuel, declining infantry support, and overwhelming enemy artillery. Analyses of the campaign also highlight deficiencies in German intelligence assessments, as repeated underestimation of Soviet force concentration contributed to unsuccessful counterattacks. The bridgehead's legacy also extends into the cultural and memorial landscape of post-war Poland. While major battles like Kursk or Stalingrad overshadow it in global memory, the Baranov sector holds local significance. Memorials, plaques, and museum exhibits commemorate both Soviet and Polish soldiers who fought in the region. These commemorations reflect shifting political contexts. During the communist era, the bridgehead was emphasized as part of narratives highlighting Soviet liberation. After 1989, Polish historiography began placing greater emphasis on the civilian experience and the complexity of wartime occupation, reframing the bridgehead's history within broader themes of resistance, suffering, and survival. At the strategic level, the bridgehead demonstrated how localized operational decisions can influence the trajectory of the war, Holding the bridgehead for 6 months allowed the Soviets to maintain continuous pressure on German forces and prepare for a major offensive under favorable conditions. When the offensive was finally launched, the existence of a ready-made armored staging area enabled rapid penetration of German lines, contributing to the collapse of German defenses in Poland and accelerating the war's end. In the long view, the Baranów Bridgehead exemplifies the intersection of operational endurance, strategic necessity, and human cost. It reshaped military planning on both sides, influenced post-war territorial realities, and left a physical and psychological imprint on the region it consumed. Its historical significance lies not only in the decisive offensive it enabled, but also in the accumulated experiences of those, soldiers and civilians alike, who endured its 6 months of unrelenting conflict.